All right. Well, thanks very much, Sonia. Welcome, everybody. Just show of hands, how many people came here by plane? Wow. Okay, well, welcome. And for everyone who came from other countries, welcome to Canada. We're very happy to have you all here. Let me also thank our mentors. There's mentors from all the CDL sites around the world. You do critical work. This whole initiative, CDL, of course, not-for-profit, and everything is enabled by the mentorship. And so thank you all for everybody who makes that time commitment and brings these science projects to life. And finally, congratulations to all of the founders. You made it here to Super Session, which means that you made it through the CDL process. Well done. This session today is Crossing the Rubicon. We're focused on machine intelligence. And it was in this room in 2015 that we hosted what I still think was the first conference in the world on the economics of machine learning. It seems hard to believe because now you can't throw a stick without hitting a meeting on AI. But in 2015, I think that was the first one in the world. And at that meeting, to put it in perspective, on this stage, there was Jeff Hinton, who's subsequently won a Nobel Prize, Ilya Sutskever, who Elon recruited to then go and found OpenAI. Jack Clark was here, who then went on to found Anthropic, co-found Anthropic. Russ Salkutinov was on the stage. Russ was the next year recruited to lead AI at Apple. Yasha Bengio and Rich Sutton were both here, who then went on both to win the Turing Award, which is effectively the Nobel Prize in computer science. And the reason we could get them all is because nobody cared about this as a subject area. And so we were out in the lunatic fringe, focusing on the economics of this topic. So we've been thinking about machine intelligence, the economics of this, for over a decade. And today's session, the next 2 hours, we are not focused on the tech. What we're focused on is the gap between the capability and what we're actually doing with it. And because the gap is getting so big, our focus here is on the returns to imagination. In other words, the imagination of what we as a species can do with this technology. So when the gap between the capability of a technology and what we're actually doing with it is small, then you can imagine that there is a small return to imagination. But when the gap is big and getting bigger and bigger by the minute, as this technology races forward, but our application of it remains quite pedestrian, that the returns to imagination are very high. So to remind you all, the mission of CDL is to enhance the commercialization of science for the betterment of humankind. This mission hasn't changed since we started CDL in 2012. And of course, the science that we're focused on right now is the advance of this particular technology, machine intelligence, but as you saw this morning, even right from the first technology, that was the robotic gripper from Italy, from the CDL Milan, uses advances in machine intelligence in their control system for their gripper. So the way we're organizing these 2 hours is in 3 parts. The first part is on the gap between where we are and the bottlenecks that are preventing us to get to where we need to be. One of those key gaps being imagination. The second part is, why is imagination so hard? Why are we so obsessed, the newspapers, everything's so focused on the potential downsides, and almost nobody writing about what could a good outcome look like? Almost nobody. And then we're going to conclude with something that in the CDL reading group we had a couple of years ago, Margaret Atwood. And she made the remark, there is no such thing as the future. There are many futures, and we'll get the one we deserve. And so that will be our focus in part 3, which is, of these many futures, what could be one that would be worth aspiring for all of us? So I'm going to wind back the tape, which is a very kind of recent history by normal standards, ancient history by AI standards. 2022. Remember the end of November 22, we were all introduced to ChatGPT, and then within 3 weeks, the New York Times was reporting on an internal memo inside Google that called for a so-called code red, that this was a potential threat. And so even though this is less than 4 years old, this will sound so antiquated when I read you the clip from this New York Times article. 3 weeks ago, an experimental chatbot called ChatGPT made its case to be the industry's next big disruptor. It can serve up information in clear, simple sentences rather than just a list of internal links. It can explain concepts in ways people can easily understand. It can even generate ideas from scratch, including business strategies, Christmas gift suggestions, blog topics, and vacation plans. Although ChatGPT still has plenty of room for improvement, its release led to Google's management to declare a code red. For Google, this was akin to pulling the fire alarm. Some fear the company might be approaching a moment that the biggest Silicon Valley outfits dread: the arrival of an enormous technological change that could upend the business. For more than 20 years, the Google search engine has served as the world's primary gateway to the internet. But with a new kind of chatbot technology poised to reinvent or even replace traditional search engines, Google could face the first serious threat to its main search business. Remember, Google generated the vast majority of its revenue from advertising through search. One Google executive described the efforts as make or break for Google's future. So this was what the market cap of Google looked like when that article in the New York Times was written. Google was sitting there as roughly $1 trillion market cap business. So, you might have taken looked at that and extrapolated and said, wow, by the time we get to CDL Super Session in 26, there might be just a wisp of Google left. Or you might have taken the view that, okay, Google will stabilize and everybody will adjust to the shock, and it will sort of flatten out as $1 trillion business. Or you might have said, the shock is going to spur Google into action, and they're going to rise again like a phoenix. So this is what happened until a year ago. So a year ago, the market cap had doubled, and Google had gone from a $1 trillion business to a $2 trillion business. And a year ago, in May of 2025, at the World Economic Forum, the headline that came out was a quote from the chief economist at Google, who used the expression that what was happening at Google was absolutely formidable, or because he's partly French, formidable, absolutely formidable. And the quote was, "Remember," he said, "I am sitting inside the chocolate factory, so I see a little bit further what we've got coming down the lane, and it's absolutely formidable." Well, what happened? That was May of last year, 2025. Google is now approaching a $5 trillion business. So it was $2 trillion this time last year. It was about 4.7 or something this morning. Last week, The Economist published this article. And The Economist made the argument that Google is now the king of consumer AI. So when the chief economist at Google a year ago said absolutely formidable, of course, nobody knew what was brewing at Google, except for the people who work there. And probably even the people that work there didn't have an idea in terms of what the economic impact would be. and how the market would react. Today, you were sitting at this number. So back to absolutely formidable. It's a great pleasure to welcome to CDL Super Session 26, the Chief Economist of Google. Please join me in welcoming Fabien Millet. No more code red. All right.
I will come up to the music, but don't ask me to do push-ups.
Okay. Well, first off, Fabien, thank you very much for joining us here. We're delighted to have you. This session, we're focused on the gap. And I want to start by getting into economics. So your job is to lead economics at Google, and you were there in 2022, and then made those remarks at Davos, and then everything that's transpired in the last 12 months. And so to set the stage for people who aren't familiar with what happens, in other words, in Canada, the only organizations of significance that I'm aware of in Canada that have an economics team are the banks. But economics has played a very critical role at Google, as it has in most of the tech companies who have learned how to use economics. And so for background for people who aren't familiar, of course, Google makes most of its revenue historically from advertising, and the very clever insight they had was that rather than try and price, in the old days when everyone's pricing ads, selling banners, was to auction off words, auction off searches. And so the design of the auction and fine-tuning of the auctions, which was fine-tuned by Fabien's predecessor, Halvarian, and his team. Then they innovated with nowcasting, which is they recognized when people search for stuff, it was a reflection of intent. And they had so much intent data that they could predict faster than the government macroeconomic trends like what was happening in housing, like new housing starts based on people searching for new homes, that they could predict today the consumer confidence, or auto sales, or all kinds of things that the government was relying on data that was months old. And then they really brought into the digital world the use of what's referred to as causal inference. Rather than just correlations, using techniques from econometrics to determine why one thing causes another, and the strength of that relationship. So Fabien, if you could describe for us, what is, now that we're facing this shock, technology shock, how are you marshaling the economics at Google heading into the next phase of what we're doing?
That's a super question, Ajay. Economics has a long and rich history at Google. It started with my predecessor, the great Halvarian, and of course every economist in the world learns from Hal through his textbooks. He was invited, he was at Berkeley at the time, bumped into Eric Schmidt at a conference, and Eric said, come along as a consultant. Hal said, what should I work on? And Eric explained that we were trialing some sort of auction, in our business, and that it might make us a little money. So, famous words. So indeed, Hal joined, starting from the sort of gateway of, auction theory, sort of looking at how our engineers had actually pretty cleverly already, built the system up, and improving it through his contributions of economics. But economics has flourished in all sorts of, dimensions. So at the moment, I've got a team of about 30 people, and we do roughly 4 things to understand. So, one is macroeconomic monitoring and decoding. So we understand the environment out there, how it impacts our business, helps us navigate it better. Second, business economics, where auction design is, sits there. It's bringing the best of econometrics, or causal inference, as Ajay said, to simply make better business decisions across the board. And that's from, how large should our sales force be to, what should the Waymo pricing algorithm look like. Thirdly, antitrust, regulation, policy. I always say that with success comes scrutiny, rightly so. The lawyers do the law on those things. We do the economics, analyze our conduct on the market, its efficiencies. And finally, thought leadership. And I always say these days it's AI for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because AI is transforming everything. It throws so many questions that have economic angles to us. And so whenever we sit across the table from policymakers, the question varies from AI and jobs, AI and education, AI and development, convergence, divergence. I mean, you name it. They all have economic aspects. And so that's where we put our thinking caps on. Try to look inside the company. So we put thermometers all over the place to see how AI is transforming our own workflows. Because again, we are customer zero. We dog food, everything that we sort of, plan to launch into the world. So we measure that to see a little bit further, but also try to address, these bigger policy questions that all of us are grappling with. So that's a little bit the portfolio, Ajay, at the moment.
And can you describe, for people, there's some people in this audience who run very large companies. Can you, on the fourth category, can you just give people an example of how you put sensors around the business to collect data in order to learn how the company's operating and how they're using AI?
So, I mean, this is something that Google has always done. So we are big on instrumentation, and we are big on what you might call the Kaizen philosophy in Japanese of continuous improvement. So we have always experimented on everything from the color of fonts, their size, etc. So we have a very rich experimental infrastructure, which is of course, world class, which of course, it doesn't make sense for everybody to have something as sophisticated, but I think everybody benefits from measurement because, like my great boss, Ruth Porat, President and Chief Investment Officer for Alphabet says, you cannot drive a car with mud on the windshield. And data and analytics are like the windshield wipers. So get those instrumented in your organization to measure the things that matter, to deliver on the outcomes. And here I'll cite you, Ajay, where you were talking to an airline and somebody told you, I want to be the best AI airline in the world. And you said, I don't know what that means, like if you told me I want to have the least, lost luggage or, like the fastest connections, etc., I can help you operate that and instrument it, but I cannot deal with this kind of amorphous goal. So essentially find your OKRs and track against it. Excellent.
Okay. So this is, I would say this is the biggest distraction is in machine intelligence is the focus on AI for consumer AI and enterprise AI, as opposed to a different category. In other words, Google is fighting it out with the other, competing with the other frontier model companies with language models. But they are really out alone in arguably the category that matters most, that is talked about least. And that's AI for scientific innovation. So let me just talk for a moment about why this matters. These are two of the world's most prolific economists in the area of economic growth, how the economy grows. On the left is Darren Acemoglu, a professor at MIT, and across the country on the right is Chad Jones, professor at Stanford. And they are, in some sense, you could think of them as bookends, even though they know each other very well, and they are sitting there at the very pinnacle of the profession. They have very different views of machine intelligence. Daron, by the way, won the Nobel Prize last year and was a speaker at our super session 2 years ago. And so he takes the view that AI is much ado about nothing. It's going to have very limited impact on economic growth. So the total factor productivity and GDP in the next 10 years that can be upper bounded by 0.5% and 0.9% respectively, he argues. On the other side, Chad Jones, who makes the point that acceleration of economic growth to some rate, perhaps 10% per year. He's not arguing it's going to be 10%, but he's even entertaining the idea in an exercise that he's doing on how much risk we should be willing to take, given that the potential for growth. And he entertains the idea of imagined growth at 10%. Now, you might be saying, 0.5%, 10%, 2%, 3%, potato, does it really matter? I know everybody knows this, but I just want to remind you something about economic growth. Is 2% a year versus 4% a year? Because it compounds year after year, that if you have 2% growth, in 50 years, the economy will be 2.5 times the size it is today. If you have 4% growth, it'll be closing in on 7 times. Okay, so in other words, tiny percentage differences compounded over time make a big difference. If it was 10% growth, we're in an economy 50 years from now that's 100 times bigger than it is today. So everybody in this room knows it. Just a reminder, because sometimes it's easy to forget, that these differences, when you hear people arguing about is it 2% growth or 4% growth, it makes a very big difference, the growth rate. Okay, why do Daron and Chad arrive at such different views? Two very smart people, they both read every important paper in this field, yet they arrive at different views. Why? The answer is their view on science. Daron says, I do not discuss how AI can have revolutionary effects by changing the process of science, because large-scale advances of this sort do not seem likely within the 10-year time frame. Whereas Chad says, it seems likely that AI will augment our abilities to innovate in the near term. And it's certainly within the realm of possibility that AI could match or even exceed human intelligence at many cognitive tasks and begin innovating itself. Once machines can produce ideas, the limits to growth set by the quantity and quality of researchers go away. Okay, so that's at the root of why two of the leading growth economists in the world take such different views, is because they have a different assumption on AI and science. Now, many people say, but wait a minute, aren't AIs just stochastic parrots? They repeat, so they train on human data and then they amplify it. How on earth could they come up with anything new? But we know, and this is now feels like ancient news, that a reinforcement learner, this famous move 37, came up with a move that no person had ever played before to beat the world's expert at Go. And not long after that, some of the researchers at Google awarded a Nobel Prize for advances in chemistry. In other words, a tool used for science. And so, Fabien, if you could just share with us, because everybody in this room is very familiar with the language models, and people watch robots and so on YouTube videos, but I think it's many people don't realize how far ahead Google is from everybody else in terms of AI for science, and what is coming down the pipe. So if you could share with us that and how you're linking that in Google, given that you're in the chocolate factory in your economic modeling.
Okay, let me start with a little bit of contextualization and then sort of move back to Google. Post-2005, we've had quite a bit of productivity slowdown in our economies, many advanced economies. The reasons are multifaceted, but one reason that economists have been debating goes directly to the heart of what we call total factor productivity, or ideas generation. So in 2009, Ben Jones had a paper called The Burden of Knowledge and the Death of Renaissance Man. And so he was making the simple observation that the stock of knowledge had grown by so much that essentially you could only become a master of very narrow slivers of fields, and that it led to all sorts of consequences. Nobel Prizes are typically gotten later in life. Teams of scientists that manage to make breakthroughs are larger and larger because you need to bring more disciplines into the mix, because often innovation is at the intersection of disciplines. So essentially that we were weighed down, if you will, by the stock of knowledge. It's also related to, if you want to read a biography, Thomas Young, 19th century British scientist, the title is The Last Man Who Knew Everything. So the death of the polymath, because again, this stock of knowledge. And then you have a very famous paper by Nick Bloom at Stanford and co-authors called Are Ideas Getting Harder to Find? So this was in 2020, and they quantified, this kind of drag from the sort of, stock of knowledge becoming harder and harder to progress. And essentially they said that they found that in an economy like the United States, just in order to keep GDP per capita growth constant, you have to double research effort every 13 years, 13. So that's what we're up against. Now, the beauty of AI is that it promises to be a force multiplier for science. It promises to increase research productivity. And a moment ago, Ajay had a slide with a Nobel ceremony that awarded my colleagues Demis Hassabis and John Jumper the Nobel Prize in chemistry. It's amazing that I get to work with people like that. I was hanging out with John just last week. But what was that innovation about? So you may have heard of AlphaFold. It solved a decades-old puzzle or challenge in science, essentially predicting the structure of proteins. And up to the point where they unleashed their system, predicting the structure of a single protein could take years in the lab and cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. Their system gave to the scientific community the structure of 200 million proteins in one fell swoop. It's all open to everybody. Millions, and I mean millions of researchers across the world are using it right now across 190 plus countries and looking at treatments for cancer, malaria vaccines, sleeping disease, on and on and on. It's been called the greatest contribution to drug discovery in our lifetimes. So just think about that unlock. It's been made possible by AI. And the beauty of AI is it allows us to search over vast solution spaces. If you're trying to design a small molecule drug, you're looking at 10 to the 60 possible combinations. It's just hopelessly large from a human perspective. But if you have AI to your side to search that combinatorial space and surface the more promising ideas, then you apply human judgment on top. Actually, this replicates your AI and science paper structure very nicely, Ajay. Then you have a fighting chance. And then you've got this tailwind that we've been lacking. So that's where the promise of AI and science is. And we've got a number of cool things at Google that we have already released, pre-release, or are in the back room to help further there, because we are very, very focused on this.
And Fabien, can you share just what should people be excited about over the next 12 months in terms of advances on AI and science?
So maybe a couple of things. There's really a lot happening in this space. But I'll mention maybe our co-scientist product, essentially. So having an AI partner as a scientist for hypothesis generation. And this already works very, very well. In fact, I have a story for you. This is, England, Imperial College, a team of researchers there were studying superbugs and how they develop antibiotic resistance. And so they spent years, I think near a decade, developing some hypotheses as to the mechanics driving that phenomenon. And then at some point, the Google co-scientist was applied to the problem, and one of his researchers, this is all on the BBC, was out and about in a shopping mall and got a call that our system had generated the same hypotheses that the team had arrived at after all of those years of research. And initially, he was in disbelief. He was a lead researcher. He was like, did they get access to our data or not? We didn't. But they are now using that to help progress their thinking faster. So that kind of partnership is now a thing of the present. The other thing I'll mention, and this is fresh, hot off the presses because we released it at I/O, is ERA. Not the Taylor Swift tour, but empirical research assistance. And this is a very, very cool sort of application of AI, where if you have a scorable problem, it helps you, select the right model for that problem. And that's going to be used in all sort of manner of scientific domains. But I'm excited to say that we've got a paper in the works showing how it can also be used for economics and economic forecasting specifically to automatically do model selection. And in our trials, it works pretty well. I will not sort of steal the thunder of a paper, but we looked at a number of benchmarks from the Chicago Fed to consensus expectations, and it can really perform quite well, which could be a revolution in itself. So Ajay, you're right. The consumer conversation is around large language models, but there is a lot happening in the more numerate quantitative space, because if you think about it, fundamentally, the sort of architecture that underlines LLMs of predict the next word can be applied to predict the next number. And so suddenly you have time series forecasting model, times FM 2.5, another Google model that you can play with that's already out there, but in nobody's radar. Well, you can actually develop those architectures to solve different kinds of problems, and that's going to be very exciting too.
Excellent, thank you. So just for everybody, like in terms of the mental model you have of AI in science, is you can think about every one of the implementations that we see that are always on the front page and get all the news attention. Let's say like driverless cars. Each one of those is a golden egg in terms of the productivity gains and the long-term benefits. Think of each one of those as a potentially a golden egg. Every application. AI advancing our method of innovation is like enhancing the goose. Okay, so everything else is an egg, and AI for science is the goose. And that's why it's so important to keep our eyes on AI in science, because it is by far has the biggest potential for our long-term economic growth. Okay, in trying to wrap their minds around this at Google, we have, everybody remembers back in first year, second year university, you did economics 101 and 100 and 101 and microeconomics and macroeconomics. That wasn't good enough at Google when they're trying to figure out how to wrap their arms around a technology shock like AI, and they're working in this new term that you've characterized as mesoeconomics. Can you give a description of what that is?
So this is something I am toying with that I repeatedly mean to write but never have time for, so you get the primeur on the topic. Let's take a step back. For the last 20 years, I've always been told, like the digital world is cause for rethinking economics. We need to sort of go back to the drawing board. And I have always told people, that is silly. It's not because you invent a faster airplane that you need to redesign the laws of physics. But more recently, I have sort of come to a sort of different perspective because AI is truly gigantic in terms of its impact on the economy. And one of the shortcuts that we take as economists, you might call it one of our sins, is ceteris paribus in Latin. So other things equal. We like to analyze things market by market, sort of look at sort of the local equilibrium and say, well, there might be other effects elsewhere, but like we can ignore them as a first approximation. AI is not about second-order effects that are ignorable. It's too important in terms of a productivity uplift, and it affects too much of the economy. So that has led me to think that we might need to move away from this ceteris paribus approach and look at things in a more general equilibrium way. And so this is where mesoeconomics comes in. So microeconomics, you analyze behavior at the individual level, household level, firm level. There's macroeconomics at the other end of the spectrum where you look at the big aggregates in the economy. Unemployment, those sorts of things. In between, you have a space that doesn't have much furniture in it, that people have dabbled in from time to time, that is called mesoeconomics. And this is the idea of looking at things at the sectoral level. So you might have bits of industrial organization in there, oligopoly theory. You might have the economics of clustering, economics of agglomeration. Why is there a Silicon Valley somewhere? You might also have input-output matrices. So this is the idea, and it comes from Vassily Leontiev, of looking at a shock or a demand boost in some sector of the economy and see how it ripples through across the economy. So you build a data center, you throw a bunch of money there. It leads to construction sort of industry, having more demand, which leads to money in the pocket of the workers, which leads to more demand for services. So it's tracking this chain of effects through what we call Leontiev multipliers. So it's kind of direct impacts, indirect impacts, induced impacts. And when you think about AI fundamentally, I always characterize it as a radical reduction in the price of knowledge and analysis in the economy. And so that's an invitation for us to think about these interlinkages. And suddenly you might think, well, if legal services become more affordable, then maybe that has a linkage into sort of real estate transactions. There might be more of them, which also has a linkage into construction. And so looking at these things basically in the round, I think is an area we're going to need to invest in.
Okay. Last year, at Davos, you said, okay, the next year, absolutely formidable. Now the next year, heading into 2027?
I'm still on absolutely formidable.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, I'm going to invite you. You can take your seat and then come back for the third part. Thank you, Fabien.
Thank you, Ajay.